the silence in our house had shifted. It wasn't the comforting quiet I'd grown used to after 30 years of marriage, it was something else entirely. Lately, Laura's behavior had become increasingly suspicious. Long nights working late, her phone clutched tightly to her side, and excuses that didn't quite add up. I knew something was wrong. I wasn't the type to sit idly by and let my life fall apart. If there was one thing I'd learned in my years as a man, it was this: control your world, or someone else will. It started small. A dinner receipt for two, tucked haphazardly into her purse. I found it while grabbing some cash one morning. The restaurant? A place she hadn't mentioned visiting in years, and certainly not with me. Then there were the hushed phone calls in the middle of the night. She thought she was clever, stepping out onto the patio and whispering just loud enough to make me question her every word. Instead of confronting her outright, I decided to act. Confrontation without evidence is weak, I needed proof. I installed a discreet camera in the living room, a place where she often lingered on her nights off. It wasn't about catching her in the act, it was about reclaiming control. A few days later, I reviewed the footage. Laura wasn't home yet, and I had time. I didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't deny the anger building as I hit play. There it was, a man sitting on my couch, comfortably sipping wine from our glasses. Laura entered the frame, laughing in a way I hadn't seen her do in years. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. I paused the video. That was all I needed to see for now. It was no longer a question of whether she was betraying me, it was a matter of what I was going to do about it. And I wasn't about to play the victim. I copied the footage to a secure drive and deleted the file from the system. The last thing I needed was for her to find it before I had a chance to act. Then, I went upstairs and started making calls. The bank was first. Joint accounts were frozen. Her cards? Cancelled. She wouldn't even notice until she tried to use them. Next, I contacted my attorney. The marriage might have spanned 3 decades, but that didn't mean I'd let it end with her walking away unscathed. No, she'd get what she deserved. As I prepared for what would come next, I reflected on what had brought us to this moment. A man loses respect in his home when he stops being a leader. Women thrive on chaos and emotion, but they also respect strength and decisiveness. I'd allowed stability to make me complacent, and now I was paying the price. Laura didn't know it yet, but her world was about to change. I wouldn't wait for her excuses, her lies, or her pitiful attempts to justify her betrayal. The moment she stepped through that door, the life she thought she controlled would come crashing down around her. Laura came home later than usual that evening. She walked through the door with the same practiced smile she had worn for months, her purse dangling casually from her arm, and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The tension in her demeanor was palpable, but she played her role perfectly. "Hey," she greeted me, setting her things down on the counter. "Sorry, traffic was a nightmare tonight." "Traffic," I repeated flatly, not even pretending to believe her. She paused, glancing at me out of the corner of her eye. "Yeah." The freeway was backed up for miles. "Some kind of accident, I think." I didn't respond. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and watched her with deliberate calm. She hated silence. It made her squirm. For a moment, I thought she'd crack under the weight of her own lies, but she simply poured herself a glass of wine and retreated to the kitchen. As soon as she disappeared upstairs, I pulled out my laptop and reviewed the files I had gathered earlier. It was all there, the messages, the pictures, the videos. She had underestimated me, thinking I wouldn't notice the subtle shifts in her behavior. But I had noticed everything. Her late nights and secretive phone calls weren't just signs of distraction, they were evidence of betrayal. And now, with every shred of proof carefully organized, I knew exactly what I had to do. I spent the next few hours making preparations. First, I contacted the bank and ensured that all joint accounts were frozen. Her access to credit? Cancelled. She wouldn't even realize it until she tried to use one of her cards. Next, I sent a secure copy of the evidence to my attorney. Divorce proceedings would start the moment I gave the signal. By the time Laura came downstairs, I was sitting calmly at the dining table, pretending to read an article on my phone. She stopped mid-step, her expression briefly flickering with confusion before she plastered on her usual smile. "What are you doing up so late?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. I glanced at her, then back at my phone. "Just reading," I said casually. She lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something more, but eventually retreated to the living room. I let her believe everything was fine. The real game would begin tomorrow. The next morning, after she left for work, I made my first move. Brian Howard was easy to find. A quick search revealed his workplace, social media accounts, and even a photo of him with his wife and 2 young kids. He had everything to lose, and I was going to make sure he lost it. I called his office, disguising my voice just enough to sound unfamiliar. "This is John Daniels," I said, my tone firm and professional. "I need to schedule a meeting with Mr. Howard to discuss a potential partnership." The receptionist transferred me to his assistant, who scheduled the meeting without hesitation. Salesmen like Brian never passed up the chance to make a deal, even if they didn't recognize the name. That afternoon, I arrived at his office building with a folder full of evidence. When Brian walked into the conference room, his confident demeanor faltered for just a moment as he sized me up. "Mr. Daniels?" he asked, extending his hand. I ignored it, sliding the folder across the table instead. "Sit down," I said, my voice cold and controlled. He hesitated but obeyed, his brow furrowing as he opened the folder. The color drained from his face as he flipped through the contents, photos of him and Laura, screenshots of their texts, and even a printed transcript of the video where they toasted to their future together. "You've been busy," I said, leaning back in my chair. Brian's hands trembled as he set the papers down. "Listen," he started, his voice unsteady. "This isn't what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I interrupted sharply. "And you're going to end it. Today." He blinked, as if struggling to process my words. "You'll block her number, delete every trace of her from your life, and pretend she never existed," I continued. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure your wife, your kids, and your boss know exactly who you are. And believe me, this evidence will ruin you." Brian swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my threats. "All right," he muttered. "I'll end it." "You'd better," I said, rising from my seat. "Because if I hear so much as a whisper of you going near her again, you'll regret ever meeting her." As I walked out of the building, a sense of satisfaction settled over me. This was just the first step, and there was still much more to do. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was back in control. Brian walked out of that office looking like a man who thought he'd dodged a bullet. That smug tilt of his head, the forced casual stride, it was all a performance. Men like him think they are untouchable, as if charm and arrogance can smooth over anything. But he was wrong. He wasn't untouchable. He was my next project. When I got home, I didn't waste time. I went straight to my study, locked the door, and laid out everything I had collected. The texts, the photos, even the stupid receipt she hadn't bothered to hide properly, it all painted a clear picture. But I wasn't just going to confront them with this. That would have been too easy. I needed to turn their betrayal into something they'd regret every day for the rest of their lives. I started with Brian's career. A quick dive into his company's website gave me everything I needed. His bio, his position, his achievements, it was all there, crafted to make him look like the golden boy of sales. But people like Brian always leave loose threads. His social media was full of them. Bragging about deals, flaunting trips to expensive resorts, posing in front of a leased car he couldn't afford. It didn't take long to find the right angle. I wrote an email to his HR department, careful to make it look like it came from a concerned client. The tone was measured, professional. I mentioned discrepancies in his invoices and attached a few fabricated documents I'd whipped up. Just enough to cast doubt without immediately implicating him. HR departments love investigations, and I knew they'd bite. Then, I turned my attention to his wife, Emily. She deserved the truth. I found her email easily enough. It wasn't hard when Brian was careless about privacy. My message to her was simple: screenshots of his texts with Laura, photos of their meetings, and the recording of their dinner where they toasted to their future. No commentary, no embellishment. Just the cold, hard truth. The next morning, Laura was up early, humming some song I didn't recognize as she made coffee. Her cheerfulness would have been endearing once. Now it felt like an insult. "Morning," she said brightly, glancing at me over her shoulder. "Busy day ahead?" "Not really," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "How about you?" "Big meetings all day," she said, grabbing her bag. She always dressed sharp for her meetings. A little too sharp. "Have a good one," I said, watching her leave. The moment she was out the door, I grabbed my keys and followed her. She didn't go to work. Instead, she drove across town to a small cafe. I parked nearby, keeping out of sight, and waited. Brian arrived not long after. He looked different, disheveled, anxious. He sat across from Laura, and their conversation quickly turned heated. He gestured wildly, his frustration spilling out for anyone to see. Laura leaned in, her expression tight, clearly trying to calm him down. I recorded it all from a distance, but the best part came when another man stormed into the cafe. He was tall, broad, and walked like someone who didn't care about the consequences. It didn't take me long to figure out who he was: Emily's brother. The confrontation was immediate. He slammed his hands on the table, pointing a finger at Brian. Laura recoiled, her eyes wide with shock. I couldn't hear what was said, but the tension was palpable. Then came the punch. It landed square on Brian's jaw, sending him stumbling into a chair. The cafe erupted in chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as people scrambled to get out of the way. Laura just stood there, frozen, while Emily's brother loomed over Brian, ready to strike again. I didn't stop recording until the dust had settled. Watching Brian get humiliated like that felt like the first real step toward balance. When I got home, Laura was already there, pacing the living room. She froze when she saw me, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. "John," she started, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, setting my keys on the counter. Her voice cracked. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. I can fix this." I stared at her, letting the silence drag. Finally, I said, "Fix this? You think this is something you can fix with a few tears and a promise? You burned everything to the ground, Laura. There's nothing left to save." Her eyes brimmed with tears, her shoulders shaking as she tried to speak. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "Don't insult me," I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Every choice, every lie, it was deliberate. And now, you're going to live with the consequences." Her tears didn't move me. "Pack your things," I said, my voice cold. "You're leaving tomorrow." She opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it. I turned away, heading to my study. She could cry all night if she wanted to. It wouldn't change a thing. This wasn't over, not yet. Laura didn't leave the house the next morning. She didn't pack, didn't say a word about the ultimatum I'd given her the night before. Instead, she stayed in the bedroom, door closed, as if shutting herself away could make the consequences of her actions disappear. It was pathetic. I didn't press her, not yet. Let her stew in her guilt and fear for a while longer. I had bigger priorities. The chaos I'd unleashed on Brian was only the beginning. His job, his marriage, his carefully curated life, I was going to take all of it apart. I sat in my office, reviewing the footage from the cafe. Watching him get punched in front of Laura, the patrons scattering in panic, it was satisfying, but I wasn't done. People like Brian never learn until they lose everything. A thought struck me. Brian wasn't just careless, he was stupid. A man who brags about success he doesn't have usually leaves a trail. I spent the next few hours digging through public records and social media. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for: illegal disputes. He had been sued twice in the past 5 years for breach of contract and failure to deliver on promised deals. This was my opening. I contacted one of the plaintiffs, a small business owner who had filed against Brian but hadn't been able to collect. Pretending to be an interested party, I asked about the case, expressing concern over a potential partnership with Brian. The owner, clearly bitter, was all too happy to share details, even forwarding documents. By the afternoon, I had what I needed to build a bigger case. Brian wasn't just a liar, he was a fraud. I sent an anonymous tip to a local journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. Within an hour, I got a response. "Do you have proof?" the reporter asked. "Oh, I have plenty," I replied, attaching everything I'd compiled. The reporter's excitement was palpable, even through email. They promised to start digging immediately. Brian wouldn't just lose his job, he'd lose his name. That evening, Laura finally emerged from the bedroom. She looked disheveled, her eyes red and swollen. "John," she said softly, standing in the doorway. "I don't know what to do." I looked up from my laptop, unimpressed. "You don't know what to do? Pack your things." That would be a start. Her lip trembled, but I wasn't about to let her crocodile tears change anything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" I shot back, my tone sharp. "For lying to my face? For bringing him into our lives? For throwing away everything we built? Be specific, Laura." She flinched, her shoulders slumping. "I made a mistake." I slammed my laptop shut, rising from my chair. "Stop calling it a mistake. Mistakes happen by accident. This was a series of choices. Choices you made over and over again." She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. "You betrayed me," I continued, my voice steady but cold. "And now, you're going to deal with the consequences. Tomorrow, you gone. No discussion. No excuses." For a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she nodded, tears streaming down her face as she turned and walked away. The next morning, she was gone. Or so I thought. When I went downstairs, I found her sitting in the living room, a suitcase by her side. "I need to say something," she said, her voice trembling. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. "Make it quick." "I know I can't fix this," she began, her words stumbling over themselves. "But I need you to know it wasn't about you. It wasn't because of anything you did." I laughed, the sound bitter. "It wasn't about me? That's supposed to make this better? You think it's less insulting to know you threw away our marriage because of your own selfishness?" Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. "I don't know why I did it. I don't even know what I was thinking." I shook my head, disgusted. "You knew exactly what you were thinking. You wanted something new, something exciting. And now you're left with nothing." I walked past her, heading for the door. "Lock up when you leave. And don't come back." That afternoon, the article went live. The journalist had worked fast, and the results were brutal. The headline read, "A local sales executive exposed, a fraud, lawsuits, and a scandalous affair." I couldn't help but smile as I read it. Every dirty detail about Brian's professional life was laid bare for the world to see. The reporter had even managed to track down Emily for a comment. She didn't hold back, calling Brian a liar and a disgrace and hinting at their impending divorce. Brian's career was over. His marriage was over. His life, as he knew it, was over. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Brian's life was burning, and I was the one holding the match. But this wasn't enough, not yet. Men like him, who believe they can manipulate and steal without consequences, deserve to lose everything. And I wasn't finished watching him fall. That morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the newspaper folded on the table beside me. Brian's face was splashed across the front page. Local executive faces embezzlement charges, the headline read in bold black letters. It was a good start, but it wasn't the end. Not for me. I scrolled through my phone, reading the emails Mike had sent. He'd found everything I needed: bank transfers, fake invoices, even a list of names Brian had scammed over the years. It was incredible how sloppy he'd been. He thought his arrogance would protect him, that no one would ever look too closely. He was wrong. By midday, I was meeting Mike in person. We sat in a small diner on the edge of town, tucked into a corner booth away from prying eyes. He slid a folder across the table, thick with papers and printouts. "This is it," he said, sipping his coffee. "Everything you need to ruin him completely." I flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. Bank statements, confidential emails, even phone records, it was all there, laid out in damning detail. "How solid is this?" I asked, meeting Mike's gaze. "Rock solid," he replied. "The DA's already interested. They'll press charges as soon as you give them the go-ahead." I closed the folder and leaned back in my seat. For a moment, I just stared out the window, watching the cars pass. It felt surreal, holding this much power over someone's life. "Do it," I said finally. Mike nodded. "You've got it." That evening, Laura called again. I didn't answer the first time or the second. By the third, I let it ring just long enough before picking up. "John," she started, her voice strained. "I need to talk to you." "You've got 2 minutes," I said coldly. She hesitated, her breath hitching. "I know you're behind this. The article, the charges, it's you, isn't it?" I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch. "John, please," she continued, her tone desperate now. "He's already lost everything. His job, his reputation, he's finished. Isn't that enough? Was it enough when you lied to me?" I asked, my voice sharp. "When you humiliated me? When you brought him into our lives?" She started to cry, the sound raw and unfiltered. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to say." "Then don't say anything," I snapped. "You made your choices, Laura. Now you're living with them." I ended the call, tossing my phone onto the coffee table. Her apologies didn't matter anymore. Nothing she said could erase what she'd done. The next morning, I got a text from Mike. "It's done. The DA's filing charges today." I turned on the TV, flipping to the local news. There it was, Brian, being escorted out of his office in handcuffs. His face was pale, his jaw tight as reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. I couldn't help but smile. This was justice, not just for me, but for every person he'd hurt along the way. Later that day, I went through the box Laura had left behind. Letters, photos, little trinkets from the life we'd built together, it was all there, a painful reminder of what we'd lost. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of regret. Almost. I picked up a photo of us from years ago, back when things were simpler. We were smiling, her hand resting on my chest as we posed in front of the house we'd just bought. I stared at it for a long time before tossing it back into the box. I carried the whole thing outside, set it in the fire pit, and struck a match. The flames licked at the edges of the box, consuming everything inside. I stood there, watching until there was nothing left but ash. Some things aren't worth saving. The sound of her car in the driveway wasn't surprising. It wasn't even unsettling anymore. By this point, it was almost routine. Laura showing up uninvited, clutching some excuse or story, hoping to fix what couldn't be fixed. I didn't rush to the door. I stayed in the garage, finishing what I was doing, sorting through a pile of old tools I hadn't touched in years. When I finally opened the door, she stood there, smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way people seem diminished when the weight of their choices finally crashes down on them. She held a folder close to her chest, like it was some kind of shield. "John," she said, her voice soft and uncertain. "Can I come in?" "What's the point, Laura?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Haven't we said everything there is to say?" "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. I should have turned her away. Instead, I stepped aside, letting her into the house one last time. She chose the kitchen, always the kitchen, like it still meant something. She placed the folder on the table, her hands shaking as she opened it. "I'm not here to make excuses," she started, her voice trembling. "I know what I did. I know how much I hurt you. But I need you to hear me out." I sat across from her, keeping my expression unreadable. "Go on," I said flatly. She took a deep breath, pulling out a stack of papers and photographs. "I didn't just betray you," she said, her voice breaking. "I betrayed myself. Brian, he convinced me to invest in one of his projects. He said it was our chance to build a future, to have something more. And you believed him," I said, more a statement than a question. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I thought I was helping us. But it was all a lie. I lost everything, John. Everything." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just stared at the stack of papers, at her trembling hands, at the woman I used to know. "You threw away our life for a scam," I said finally, my voice cold. "You lied to me. You humiliated me. And for what? A fantasy?" "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know where else to go." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't move me. "Not anymore. You made your choices, Laura," I said, standing. "And now you get to live with them." She pushed the folder toward me, her hands trembling. "This is all I have left," she said. "Photos, letters, things from before I ruined everything. If you don't want them, burn them. I just thought you should have the choice." I stared at the folder for a long moment, then pushed it back toward her. "I don't need reminders of what you destroyed," I said simply. Her shoulders sagged, and for a second, I thought she might collapse. But instead, she stood, clutching the folder to her chest. "Goodbye, John," she said softly. "Goodbye," I replied without hesitation. I didn't watch her leave. The sound of the door closing was enough. That night, I sat on the back porch with a glass of whiskey in hand. The folder was still on the table beside me, untouched. The fire pit in front of me was cold, but I could already see the flames in my mind. For a moment, I considered opening the folder. Maybe there was something inside worth keeping, a reminder of the good times, before everything fell apart. But then I shook my head. Some things are better left in the past. I carried the folder to the fire pit, striking a match. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges of the photos and turning the letters to ash. I stood there, watching until nothing remained but smoke. The next morning, my phone buzzed on the counter. It's done, Mike's text read. Brian's looking at 15 years minimum. DA isn't holding back. I stared at the message for a moment, letting it sink in. Finally, I typed back, "A good." For the first time in weeks, the storm inside me began to settle. Later that day, I went to the cemetery. My parents' graves were still there, shaded by the same old oak tree that had stood there my entire life. I stood there in silence, letting the quiet seep in. "I'm still here," I said softly. Still standing. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. This chapter of my life was over. The fire pit was still smoldering when I stepped outside with my coffee that morning. The acrid scent of burnt paper hung in the air, mingling with the damp coolness of early sunlight. The ashes from Laura's folder swirled lazily in the breeze, carried off like the memories they represented. I thought I'd feel lighter. Cleaner, maybe. But as I stared at the charred remains, that weight in my chest hadn't lifted. It sat there, unmoving, like an anchor. The buzzing of my phone on the kitchen counter dragged me back to the present. Mike's name flashed on the screen. They froze Brian's accounts. Big news dropping soon. Check the local station. I grabbed the remote and flipped on the TV. It didn't take long to find the story. Brian Warren, from executive to exposed fraud, the anchor announced, her voice dripping with that practiced tone of faux sympathy. The screen cut to footage of Brian being escorted out of a courthouse, his face pale and tight as reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret what you've done, Mr. Warren?" one of them yelled, thrusting a microphone toward him. Brian didn't answer. He just kept walking, shoulders hunched, his once proud demeanor crushed under the weight of his own downfall. I turned off the TV and tossed the remote aside. Watching him crumble should have been satisfying. And it was, partially. But it wasn't enough. By mid-afternoon, the internet had exploded. Brian's name was trending, paired with hashtags that ranged from #JusticeForAll to #BurnItDown. Memes were everywhere, mocking his fall from grace with the kind of ruthless creativity only the internet could deliver. I didn't know whether to laugh or roll my eyes. Then I saw it, a new video clip making the rounds. It showed Brian standing outside a parking garage, his phone pressed to his ear. His face was twisted with frustration as he yelled into the receiver. The audio wasn't clear, but you didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone, a desperation. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I should have been done with him, but something about the way he looked, broken, frantic, left me wanting more. That evening, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Mike. "John," a familiar voice said, smooth and deliberate. It was Emily. "Emily," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "What's this about?" "Brian's wife," she clarified, as if I needed reminding. "We need to talk." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I said, "I'm listening." "Not over the phone," she said. "Meet me. I'll text you the address." The call ended before I could argue. The cafe she'd chosen was the kind of place that blended into its surroundings, a small, nondescript building sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a pawn shop. Inside, the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale pastries. Emily was already there when I walked in, sitting in a corner booth. She looked different than she had on the news, collected, calm. Dangerous, even. "Thanks for coming," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "I didn't come for pleasantries," I said. "What do you want?" She slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is everything I have on Laura. The lies, the debts, the connections to Brian. She's not the person you think she is." I opened the envelope and began flipping through the contents. Bank transfers, emails, photos, each page more damning than the last. "She didn't just invest with him," Emily continued, her voice cool and even. "She helped him. She was part of it." I closed the folder and leaned back, my mind racing. You knew about this and didn't say anything before now? I asked. She shrugged. I wanted to see how far you'd take it on your own. Now that I see you serious, I figured you deserved the whole picture. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Laura hadn't just been a victim of Brian's schemes, she'd been complicit. She hadn't been fooled. She'd been a willing participant. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked, my voice low. That's up to you, Emily said, standing. But if I were you, I wouldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. She left without another word, leaving me alone in the booth with the envelope and a choice I wasn't ready to make. That night, I sat in my study, the contents of the envelope spread across my desk. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. Laura hadn't just destroyed our marriage, she'd played an active role in Brian's downfall. I picked up my phone and stared at her number, my thumb hovering over the call button. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to force her to admit what she'd done. But confrontation wasn't enough. She needed to feel the same cold, unrelenting consequences that Brian was drowning in. I made another call instead. Mike, I said when he answered. I've got something new for you. And you're going to love it. The revelation from Emily hit me like a freight train. Laura wasn't just a pawn in Brian's scheme, she was an accomplice. Everything she'd said, every tear she'd cried, had been part of a carefully constructed lie. I couldn't stop pacing the study. The folder Emily had given me sat open on the desk, its damning contents spilling out like a wound left untended. Photos of Laura at fancy dinners with Brian and other clients. Bank records showing transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Emails where she discussed how to minimize risk and leverage opportunities. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was calculated destruction. I stopped pacing and stared at my phone. Mike's number was already dialed, but I hadn't pressed call yet. Part of me wanted to confront Laura directly, to shove this evidence in her face and watch her crumble. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. I pressed the button. Mike, I said when he answered, my voice steady but cold. I've got something new for you. This one's going to blow everything wide open. The next morning, the fallout began. Mike didn't waste any time. By noon, the DA's office had added Laura's name to the investigation, citing new evidence implicating additional parties. The news hit like a bombshell. Laura's face was splashed across every channel alongside Brian's. The headlines were brutal: executive scandal deepens, a new accomplice revealed. I stood in front of the TV, coffee mug in hand, watching as they dissected her involvement piece by piece. Every lie she'd told, every shady transaction, every event she'd attended with Brian, it was all out in the open now. And then came the video. Someone had leaked footage of Laura leaving Brian's office late at night. The timestamp showed it was from months ago, back when she'd claimed she was working late on a big project. The grainy quality didn't matter. The internet had a field day, tearing her apart in comments and memes that spread like wildfire. I should have felt satisfied. Vindicated. But instead, there was a gnawing emptiness in my chest. That afternoon, I got a call. It was Laura. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times before finally answering. What do you want? I said, my voice flat. John, she said, her voice shaking. It's not what you think. You're going to have to be more specific, I said. Because right now, I think you're a liar and a criminal. Am I wrong? She started crying, the sound raw and desperate. I didn't know it would go this far. I swear, I didn't know. Save it, I snapped. You knew exactly what you were doing, Laura. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. I was trying to protect us, she pleaded. I thought if I played along, I could make it better. I didn't want this to happen. I laughed bitterly. Protect us? You didn't even protect yourself. You're going down with him, Laura. And you deserve every second of it. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Help me. I don't have anyone else. You had someone, I said coldly. And you destroyed that. Goodbye, Laura. I hung up before she could say another word. By evening, the situation had escalated. News vans were parked outside Laura's sister's house, where she'd been staying. Reporters hounded her every move, shouting questions and snapping photos as she tried to shield her face. Brian, meanwhile, was sinking even deeper. His lawyer had dropped him, and rumors swirled that he was trying to cut a deal by throwing Laura under the bus. It was chaos, and I was watching it all unfold from the comfort of my living room. But it still wasn't enough. That night, I called Emily again. You were right, I said when she answered. She doesn't deserve to walk away from this. I'm glad you see it that way, Emily replied. Because I have one more thing you need to know. Her tone sent a chill down my spine. What is it? Brian wasn't just scamming clients, she said. He was using Laura as bait. That's how he got people to trust him. He paraded her around like a trophy, convincing them that if she was on board, it had to be legitimate. I gripped the phone tighter. And she let him. Yes, Emily said simply. The silence between us was deafening. What do you want me to do? I asked finally. Whatever it takes, she said. Make sure neither of them gets out of this unscathed. I hung up, my mind racing. The pieces were all there. All I had to do was put them together. The next day, I met with Mike. This is everything, I said, handing him the folder. I want them both buried. Mike flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. You sure about this? Absolutely, I said. They deserve it. He nodded, closing the folder. Consider it done. As I walked out of his office, I felt the weight in my chest start to lift. Not completely, but enough. This wasn't over yet. But it would be soon. The house felt colder than usual that morning. Not because of the weather, it was something else, something heavier. The kind of cold that settled in your bones and refused to leave. I sat at the kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't bother to get up and pour another cup. The phone buzzed beside me, breaking the silence. Mike's name flashed on the screen. It's all finalized. Brian and Laura are both done. Arrests are happening tomorrow morning. It's over. I set the phone down without replying, my fingers tapping idly on the edge of the table. Over? No, it wasn't over. Not for me. By late afternoon, I was driving again. The roads were empty, stretching out ahead like they led to nowhere. The radio was on, but I couldn't hear it over the noise in my head. I didn't realize where I was going until I was already there, her sister's house. The reporters were still outside, their cameras clicking the moment they saw me step out of the car. Their questions were loud, relentless, blending into a cacophony I didn't bother to address. When her sister opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to something colder. What do you want now? She asked, her tone sharp. I'm not here to argue, I said. I need to see her. She sighed, stepping aside. You'll do what you want anyway. Laura was in the living room, sitting in the same spot as before. The blanket draped over her shoulders looked more like a shroud, her body curled into itself like she was trying to disappear. She looked up when I entered, her eyes hollow and rimmed with red. John, she said softly. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I pulled a folder from my bag and set it on the coffee table in front of her. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. What's this? Everything, I said, my voice steady but cold. Every lie, every deal, every choice you made. It's all there. She opened the folder, her breath catching as she flipped through the pages. Her face grew paler with each one, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold onto the papers. You gave this to the DA, she said finally, her voice breaking. They've had it for weeks, I replied. This is just for you. So you can see exactly how far you've fallen. Her tears started then, falling silently onto the pages she clutched. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice cracking. Why? I said, my voice rising. Because you betrayed me, Laura. You lied to me. You destroyed everything we built together, for what? Him? She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. I didn't mean for this to happen. I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and humorless. Didn't mean for what? To ruin our lives? To destroy everything? Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know exactly what you were doing. Her hands fell to her lap, the papers slipping from her grip. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. I stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder. Now. You face what's coming. And you do it alone. I walked out without looking back. That night, I sat on the porch, staring at the fire pit. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like tiny shards of glass. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. Another text from Mike. Brian's deal is officially off the table. Laura's arrest is set for tomorrow morning. It's done. I stared at the message, letting the words sink in. Then, finally, I typed back two simple words, a good work. The next morning, the headlines exploded. Executive scandal ends in arrests, Brian Warren and Laura Hart taken into custody. Their faces were everywhere, plastered across screens with commentary dissecting their every move. The internet turned them into public enemies, their names synonymous with greed and betrayal. I watched the coverage from the couch, the room bathed in the dim glow of the TV. It was over. For them. For me. The morning felt heavier than usual, like the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on the air itself. I parked my car a block away from Laura's sister's house, the engine idling for a moment before I cut it off. The street was unusually quiet except for the reporters gathered in front of the house. Their cameras stood ready, lenses pointed at the door like hunters waiting for their target. I watched from the car, leaning back in my seat as I tried to make sense of how it had come to this. The squad car arrived at 8:10 a.m., its flashing lights cutting through the dull grey morning. The reporters sprang into action, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions no one would answer. Two officers stepped out, their faces unreadable as they made their way to the door. Laura's sister answered, her expression tight with worry. She nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. When Laura appeared moments later, the air seemed to shift. She was wearing the coat I'd given her years ago, though it looked different now, worn, ill-fitting, like it didn't belong to her anymore. Her hair was tied back, but stray strands fell loose around her face, which was pale and expressionless. As they cuffed her hands behind her back, she didn't resist. But as they led her down the steps, her eyes scanned the crowd until they found me. For a moment, everything else faded. The shouting reporters, the clicking cameras, the cold morning air, it all disappeared. Her gaze lingered on mine, wide and pleading. I didn't move. Didn't blink. And then the officers nudged her forward, breaking the connection. The car door slammed shut, the sound snapping me back to reality. The reporters surged toward the vehicle, their voices growing louder as the squad car pulled away. I started my own car and drove off, taking the long way home. Brian's arrest came later in the afternoon, a similar scene playing out at his office. The footage was everywhere within minutes. He was led out in handcuffs, his face tight with anger and humiliation. Unlike Laura, he didn't go quietly. He barked something at the reporters, his words drowned out by the chaos around him. By the time I turned off the TV, his name was trending across every platform. The internet wasted no time tearing him apart, memes and comments flooding every corner of the digital world. That evening, I met Mike at a small diner just off the highway. The place was quiet, the kind of spot where the hum of the jukebox was louder than the conversations around you. Mike was already seated in a corner booth, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He nodded as I slid into the seat across from him. "It's done," he said simply. I nodded, signaling the waitress for a coffee. "I know. You should feel proud," he continued. "You saw it through." I stared at the table, tracing a finger along a scratch in the wood. "I don't know if proud is the right word," I said. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would." Mike tilted his head, studying me. "What did you think it would feel like?" "Like closure," I admitted. "Like I'd finally be able to let it all go." "And now?" I shrugged. "Now it just feels quiet." Mike nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's not a bad thing, you know. Quiet's a good start." His words lingered as the waitress set a steaming cup in front of me. Later that night, I sat by the fire pit, the stars faint above me. From my jacket pocket, I pulled the last photo. It was from years ago. Laura was smiling, her face framed by the sunlight. I was beside her, my hand resting on her shoulder, my expression almost unrecognizable. I struck a match, holding it to the corner of the photo. The flame spread quickly, curling the edges of the paper, turning the image into ash. When it was done, I let the ashes fall into the pit, their faint glow fading into the darkness. The next morning, the world felt lighter. I made coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen as sunlight poured through the windows. My phone buzzed on the counter. Emily's name lit up the screen. "It's over, John. Thank you for everything." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Take care, Emily." As I set the phone down, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was sharp, but it carried a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was something. And for now, that was enough.